The transit pod smelled like recycled air and old grief. Sergeant Dalia Nasser had been in it for 11 hours, which meant she had 11 more to go, and somewhere in the dark behind her eyes she kept returning to the same image. Her mother's hands, flour-white, pressing dough into a shape that would not hold. She was 41 years old. She had survived the siege of Awafi Station, the withdrawal from the outer belt, and one marriage that had lasted 4 years before the man inside it quietly ceased to exist. She had done none of these things gracefully. She had done them the way humans did most things, badly, stubbornly, and without adequate preparation. And she was still here, which she sometimes thought was either a testament to human resilience or an argument against an ordered universe. She had never been able to tell which. The transit carried 42 soldiers, most of them asleep or pretending to be. Dalia was neither. She had her field log open on her knee, the screen dimmed so low it was barely readable, and she was writing nothing. The cursor blinked. She watched it like it was going to do something interesting. The Veth had been in the Kepler cluster for 6 years, before anyone understood what they were doing. That was the thing nobody wanted to say out loud, even now. 6 years. They had moved through the outer settlements with a thoroughness that the first analysts called methodical and the later ones called ritual, and the ones who came after called, more accurately, devotional. They did not destroy. That was the part that broke people, early on, the part that made the first contact teams send message after optimistic message. Because an enemy that does not destroy must want something, and something that wants something can be negotiated with, reasoned with, met. What the Veth wanted was a census. They catalogued every human settlement they encountered. They documented with a precision that bordered on tenderness. Population counts, age distributions, genetic markers, health data. They did this efficiently and completely and without any visible malice, and then they took 70% of the children. Not killed, taken. Where they went, nobody had been able to determine. The Veth did not leave forwarding addresses. They left behind parents who were, in the specific and horrible way of people who have lost something without being able to grieve it properly, neither bereaved nor hopeful, just suspended, held in a moment that would not end. The colony at Awafi Station had known the Veth were coming for 3 months. Dalia's unit had been deployed to the outer ring 2 months ago, which meant they had spent 60 days building fortifications around a station that the military analysts said, in the careful language of people who want to be on record as having said something, had a 7% probability of successful defense. 7%. Someone in command had decided this was worth trying. Dalia suspected that someone had children. She closed the field log and looked out the small, reinforced port beside her. Nothing out there but the dark and the far cold light of stars that were already dead. Humans were always looking at dead light and calling it beautiful. She had never been able to decide if this said something profound about the species or something pathetic. She thought about her daughter. Sana was 11 years old and lived with Dalia's mother in what remained of the Karaman district. She was, by all accounts, a serious child, the kind who asked questions that adults found inconvenient, and then waited with unnerving patience for answers that would actually satisfy her. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and her grandmother's gift for being in the room before anyone noticed her. Dalia had not seen her in 7 months. She had a photograph, the same one she always had, of Sana at age 8 standing in front of an old water reclamation tower with the expression of someone who has just thought of something important and is deciding whether to say it. She kept the photograph in the lining of her left boot, where it would not be lost if everything else was. The transit began its deceleration sequence, and Dalia put her hands flat on her knees and breathed the way the old medic at Karaman had taught her, long before the siege, when she had been a different person with a different set of problems. You breathe down into the belly, he had said, not up into the chest. The chest is where panic lives. The belly is where you keep what you know. She knew the following. Awafi Station had a population of 14,000. Of those, approximately 4,000 were children under the age of 16. The Veth census ships had been detected at the edge of the system 9 days ago. They would reach Awafi in approximately 18 hours from now, which meant approximately 6 hours after her unit arrived. She knew one other thing, which she had not told her commanding officer, because her commanding officer would have called it a plan, and it wasn't a plan. It was barely even an idea. It was the kind of thing that came to you at 3 in the morning when you were too tired to be sensible and too stubborn to be afraid. The transit docked with a sound like a held breath releasing, and Dalia Nasser picked up her kit and went to work. Awafi Station had been built in the early expansion years by people who had not known how to build anything yet, which meant it had been built the way humans built everything in that era. Too fast, too cheap, too optimistically. The corridors were too narrow. The ventilation was inadequate. The observation deck, which had been designed by someone who believed in natural light and had apparently forgotten that Awafi's primary was a dim and distant thing, used 40% of the station's power and provided a view of approximately nothing. The station commander was a woman named Yusra Khalid, who had the look of someone who had been making hard decisions for a very long time and had stopped expecting them to become easier. She met Dalia's unit at the docking port with a handshake and the particular kind of directness that meant she had no time for courtesy and was not going to apologize for it. "The children are already in the inner ring," she said. "We started moving them 48 hours ago." "How many?" "All of them took some convincing." She said this without inflection, which meant it had taken a great deal of convincing. The parents weren't inclined to let go. Dalia understood this completely. What's in the outer ring? Everything that isn't a child. Equipment, non-essential personnel, enough food storage to make it look occupied. She paused. And the array. The array was the reason Dalia had requested this assignment specifically. Awafi Station had been built adjacent to an old Veth resonance relay, one of hundreds that dotted the cluster. Remnants of whatever the Veth had been doing out here before humans arrived. Nobody had been able to determine their function with any precision. They emitted a low-frequency pulse on a wavelength that human instruments could detect but not decode, and they had been there long enough that the rock around them had grown over them in places, which meant they were either very old or very patient, and the Veth, in Dalia's experience, were both. The station's original engineering team had, with the particular ingenuity of people who have a broken thing and a need and no other options, incorporated the relay into the station's power grid. Not well, it wasn't integrated so much as attached, the way you might attach a cart to a horse that didn't particularly want to pull it. But it worked, in the provisional and stubborn way that most things at Awafi worked, and it had been working for 11 years. What nobody had thought to ask, until Dalia had asked it 6 weeks ago in a briefing that had generated considerable skepticism, was what happened when you changed the frequency. "You've had the engineers running the tests I requested," she said. Yusra looked at her with an expression that was not quite hope and not quite doubt. "They've been running them for 3 weeks. The results are—" she stopped. "The results are strange." "Strange how?" "The Veth relay doesn't just emit when you change the input frequency. It responds like it's—" she stopped again. "Like it's listening." Dalia thought about this. She had spent 6 weeks thinking about it, but hearing it confirmed was different from suspecting it. And the children's biometrics, the census data the Veth take, do we know what format they store it in? We know it's transmitted via resonance pulse, same wavelength family as the relay. "Then we know what we need to do," Dalia said. The station commander looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "The engineers called it insane." "The engineers are probably right. It might not work." "It probably won't." Dalia picked up her kit. "Show me the array." The relay was in sublevel 4, which the original builders had designated as a maintenance corridor, and which the station's inhabitants had converted, over 11 years, into something between a storage space and an afterthought. You got to it through a hatch behind the secondary water reclamation unit, and the hatch had not been regularly maintained, and the corridor beyond it smelled like metal and time. The relay itself looked like nothing in particular. This was the thing that always surprised people who encountered Veth technology for the first time, the absence of spectacle. Human machines announced themselves. They were large, or they hummed loudly, or they had surfaces that reflected things. Veth technology was quiet and specific and did not care whether you found it impressive. The relay was a structure approximately 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide, composed of a material that was neither quite metal nor quite ceramic, that had grown into the station's infrastructure with the patience of something that had decided to belong here. Around its base, where the engineers had attached the power coupling 11 years ago, there were scorch marks and improvised brackets and 3 different types of adhesive that had been applied in what appeared to be increasing desperation. A small handwritten label, yellowed with age, read, "Do not touch, still WRKS." Standing next to it was a young engineer named Farid, who looked like he had not slept in several days and had developed strong feelings about this. "If this doesn't work," he said, by way of greeting, "we will have spent 6 weeks modifying a piece of alien infrastructure we don't understand, and will have nothing to show for it except a slightly different kind of failure." "That's accurate," Dalia said. "And if it does work, then the Veth census ships will receive a signal from this relay that tells them this system has already been catalogued, that the children here are already in the database, that there's nothing here to collect." Farid looked at the relay. Then he looked at Dalia. Then he looked at the relay again, with the expression of someone trying to work out whether a rock thrown at a window is going to break the window or just bounce off. "The Veth have never encountered a station that actively broadcast false census data before," he said. "No. We're sending a lie through their own infrastructure." "Yes. What if they can tell?" Dalia was quiet for a moment. Through the hull, somewhere above her, 14,000 people were moving through their lives with the particular intensity of people who know the time they have left is countable. The inner ring was full of children who had been told, in the careful and insufficient language adults use when they're trying not to frighten anyone, that there was a plan, that the adults had it handled, that they should stay inside and not worry. She had been one of those children once. She had never entirely forgiven the adults for how that had turned out. "Then they can tell," she said, "and we try something else." The Veth ships arrived at the system's edge 17 hours and 40 minutes after Dalia's unit docked, which was 20 minutes early, which was the kind of thing the Veth did. They arrived slightly earlier than you expected, not because they were trying to catch you off guard, but because their relationship with time was different from yours, and they did not particularly think about your expectations when planning their movements. The census ships were not large. This was another thing that startled people. You expected something terrible to be large. The Veth ships were precise. They were the size of large cargo haulers, and they moved with a steadiness that was either mechanical or intentional and was probably both, and they approached Awafi Station on a vector that suggested they had done this many times before and expected to do it many more. Dalia was at the relay when they entered scanner range. Farid was beside her. Commander Yusra's voice came through the comm in the flat, controlled register of someone doing a job they have decided to finish. "Veth lead ship is broadcasting census initiation protocol," Yusra said. "Standard format. They're telling us to prepare population documentation." "We're ready," Dalia said. She looked at the relay. The relay looked like nothing at all, the way it always did, patient and specific and completely indifferent to the drama happening around it. She thought, very briefly, about her mother's hands in flour, about Sana at 8 years old in front of the water tower, deciding whether to speak, about the photograph in her boot. She thought about the woman who had named her daughter London. She had heard this story once, from a trader who had come through Karaman years ago. An Omani woman's story passed down through the generations. A girl who had loved someone she could never reach and had folded that love into a name, pressed it into the only thing she could give. She did not know why she was thinking about it now. She thought maybe it was because she understood, finally, what it meant to love something so much that you put it somewhere safe, where the world couldn't touch it. She had named her rifle Sana. She had done this privately and never told anyone, because there was no military language for naming your weapon after your child, and yet it had seemed important, a way of keeping the two things in the same breath. What you were fighting with, what you were fighting for. Farid, she said. Ready, he said. Send it. The relay emitted a pulse. On the instruments, it looked like nothing, a small variance in the output frequency, the kind of thing that could have been a fluctuation in the power grid, the kind of thing that 11 years of jury-rigged integration might produce on any given Tuesday. But it wasn't a fluctuation. It was a message, precise and complete, encoded in the Veth's own resonance language, translated with the help of 6 weeks of analysis and the particular genius of people who are very motivated to get something right. The message said in the Veth's own syntax, this population has been catalogued, registry complete, children documented, no collection required. It said this in the Veth's own voice, from the Veth's own infrastructure, through a relay that the Veth themselves had built, and which the Veth presumably trusted, because why would you not trust your own infrastructure? Why would you imagine that the people you had been cataloging had spent 11 years accidentally integrating your census network into their power grid, and 6 weeks very intentionally learning to speak through it? The Veth ship slowed. This was not the response that anyone had predicted. The models had shown two outcomes. Either the signal was ignored and the ships continued their approach, or the signal was recognized as fraudulent and the ships accelerated. Nobody had modeled the ships slowing down, because nobody had imagined the ships would need to think about it. They're holding position, Yusra's voice very carefully neutral. Outer system edge, not advancing. They're checking, Farid said, barely above a whisper. They're cross-referencing. How long? I don't know. I don't know what their database size is. I don't know how long it takes them to verify an entry. Dalia stood very still. The relay hummed at a frequency just below hearing, the way it always did, patient and old and absolutely without opinion about any of this. 4 minutes passed. Then 8. Then the Veth lead ship's transponder shifted frequency, a change that Farid's instruments caught and flagged and that he translated, in the 6 weeks of learned Veth syntax that they had, as acknowledged, proceeding to next designation. The ships turned. Not toward Awafi, away. Dalia stood at the relay in the maintenance corridor that smelled like metal and time, and she listened to Commander Yusra's voice come through the comm with something in it that was not quite disbelief and not quite relief, and was probably the thing that exists between them, the thin and trembling thing, and she thought, 7%. Someone in command had decided 7% was worth trying. She had disagreed privately with their math. She had thought the chances were lower than that. She had tried anyway, because the alternative was to hand someone else's children to a system that catalogued them and carried them away to somewhere nameless, and this was the thing she had decided, a long time ago, that she was constitutionally unable to do. They're gone, Yusra said, cleared the system edge, Veth ships have departed. The inner ring, where the children had been waiting in the particular fidgeting silence of children who have been told to stay inside and not worry, received the news through their parents and their teachers and the station's announcement system, and the sound that came back through the hull was not a cheer. Exactly. It was something more complicated than a cheer. It was the sound of people who had been suspended in a terrible moment finally being allowed to move again. Later, 3 weeks later, After the debriefs and the reports and the argument between the military analysts about whether what had happened constituted a tactical success or an anomaly that would correct itself on next contact, Dalia stood in the observation deck and watched the dim light of Awafi's primary star. She had sent a message to her mother. The message had said, "I'm fine. The situation resolved. Tell Sana I'll be home in a month." Her mother's reply had said, "She already knew. She said you would find a way." Dalia thought about this for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be known by your child, to have a child who had absorbed enough of you that she could predict you, who had taken the thing you were and internalized it and called it certainty. She thought this was maybe the strangest and most complete form of love, to be so thoroughly yourself that the people you loved could look at a problem and say, without doubt, that you would solve it. She did not know if she had solved it. What she had done was change the frequency of a signal through infrastructure she didn't own, in a language she had learned in 6 weeks, on the theory that a lie told in the right voice would be believed, and the theory had improbably held. The Veth would come back. They would recalibrate. They would look at the registry entry for Awafi Station and eventually find that it was fraudulent. And then they would come back with different instruments and different questions, and the problem would begin again. But they had not come today. And today, 4,000 children on Awafi Station had gone to sleep in the inner ring and woken up in a world that was, for this one morning, unclassified. Not data, not entries in a census, just themselves. She pulled the photograph from the lining of her boot. Sana at 8, in front of the water tower, deciding whether to speak, the expression of someone who has just thought of something important. Dalia wondered, sometimes, what Sana would become. She had thought about this more in the last 6 weeks than in the 11 years before, maybe because proximity to losing a thing clarifies how much you want it. She thought Sana might be a doctor, or an engineer, or one of the new xenolinguists coming out of the university programs, the ones learning to speak in frequencies they hadn't grown up hearing. She thought Sana might name something, someday, after a place she had never been but had always wanted to reach. There was a tradition, very old, of naming children for things you loved beyond your reach. Dalia had heard this once and never forgotten it. A mother who named her daughter after a city she could not go to, pressing her impossible longing into the only thing she could give. It had seemed, when she first heard it, like a gesture of defeat. Now she thought it was something else entirely. It was an act of faith, a declaration that the thing you wanted was real, was worth naming, was worth putting into the world in the form of a person who might someday go where you could not. She put the photograph back in her boot. Outside, Awafi's primary cast its thin light across a system that was, for now, quiet. The stars were distant and cold, and most of them were already dead, and the light they sent was ancient, and humans looked at it anyway and called it beautiful, and Dalia had finally decided what this said about the species. Not that they were fools for loving dead light, but that they were the only things in the known universe stubborn enough to keep looking. She would go home in a month. She would sit in her mother's kitchen while her mother pressed dough into shapes with flower-white hands, and Sana would be in the room before anyone noticed her, and she would look at Dalia with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and she would not say, "I knew you would find a way." She would just look, in the way of people who are already certain, and Dalia would feel, in the specific and wordless way of people who have survived something they shouldn't have, that it was enough, that it was more than enough. That this, exactly this, was what she had changed the frequency for.